This academy is brought to you in partnership between the Wisconsin Regional Special Education Network, or RSN, the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, or DPI, and the Wisconsin Council of Administrators for Special Services, or WCAS. My name is Lindsay Schubert, and I am the RSN, or Regional Special Education Network Director for the CISA 10 region. And we are very excited to have so many folks joining us. Our team strives to be inclusive and meet the needs of all Wisconsin directors. The intent of these sessions is to provide you with timely and relevant information so that you can do your important work in our Wisconsin school districts. Just a couple of reminders as we are starting today's session. I know for some of you this might be your first session you've attended, so welcome. Please, if you are able, rename yourself with your CISA number and your first and last name. That will assist those who are taking attendance today. If you are able, we would love to have your camera on, but we would like for your mic to be muted, please, unless you are speaking with the group. We will have a parking lot that we will introduce in a moment here, and that will be used for questions. It is also linked in your agenda. That parking lot is used during today's session, but it is also used after the fact. So if there are questions that we did not get to pertaining to the topics that we're discussing today, still add those to the parking lot, and we monitor that, and we do go back and answer those questions. So that parking lot is a great tool. It's a running parking lot for the duration of the school year. We want to use the chat to respond to speaker prompts, just to make sure that we're limiting distraction in that chat. And we are recording the meetings, and we do have a playlist of recorded meetings. So we'll have a playlist of these meetings this year as well as previous meetings. And so we do ask that we are the only recording that is occurring, just because that helps to have a higher quality product when we publish those for you to view later. One of the things we are implementing this year is we are going to be sending a follow-up email to those who attended the sessions, and we will send out an updated agenda which has timestamps with the recorded where you can find the recording, as well as timestamps of where you can find the different sections. So if you're looking to rewatch just a specific section, you know how to get right to that in the recording. One more reminder here as we advance the slide is that you do need to register for each session. In your agenda, you will see the link to register for the October session. In an effort to try to ensure that everyone attending the session receives all of the materials and links as needed, we are closing registration the Friday prior to each session. That's not to say that you can't still join us. If you fail to register, reach out to your RSN or to Jen and let her know if something has come up and you failed to register. But we do want to encourage that monthly registration each month prior to that Friday before, so that we can just make sure that you have access to all of the links that you need and the resources that will be shared. All right. In our agenda today, we are going to start off with some beginning of the year logistics, as well as a special education calendar that you might find useful if you're not using already. One of our RSN colleagues, Tracy, will be presenting that information. Then we will have Daniel Parker and Lynn Wynn here from DPI to talk about some DPI updates, as well as a reorganization, which is currently ongoing at the Department of Public Instruction. We'll take a little break, and then the remainder of our morning will be spent talking about seclusion and restraint and crisis response. We are going to go over an updated frequently asked questions document that was published on the DPI website in August that captures updates that were made to Wisconsin's statute on seclusion and restraint that were actually published about 5 years ago, but are still being integrated into district systems. Then we'll take a very brief break and be joined at the end with some friends from DPI who will be discussing resources and support that is available for schools and districts if they are looking to reduce the use of seclusion and restraint in their sessions. All right. Nope. I think that's it, John, for the opening slides. So each month we invite you to, yes, we're going to take some deep breaths. We had no parking lot, right? You could probably stop sharing. Yeah. Okay, we each month we invite you to set a learning intention for yourself. So, hearing the topics that we will be covering today, we look for you to either think of a question that you might hope to have answered on those topics, or think about something that you hope to get from this year's information. And we just know that when we set an intention for our learning, we're better able to stay focused and we're better able to process and then apply the learning that we have. So we are going to start this morning, as I mentioned, with Tracy Hugden, who is the Regional Special Education Network Director for the CISA 4 region. And she is going to start with some beginning of the year resources. Welcome, Tracy.
Thank you, Lindsay. Sorry, I tried to move my People screen down to my other side and I didn't make it all the way. Sorry about that. I'm just going to share my screen quick. Let's see. This is the one I want. Oh, not the attendance. Try that one more time. Okay. Thank you for being patient with me there for a second. As Lindsay had mentioned, in the parking lot, I linked it on my part, and my part of the agenda. But we just put some examples in there about where to, like if you have a question, we'll also capture it. If you put the question in the chat, we will capture that here and then also put the response in, because we know that sometimes it was, hey, what was exactly that response, or how did they word that? So we will try to keep that up to date for you. This is the same parking lot we will use for the entire series. It will always be linked at the top of the agenda. And I see that somebody's adding information right now. If you do add your contact information, we will try to follow up with you directly. Otherwise, it will be listed here. Oops. The other thing that Lindsay already stated, this last page here, the DPI Special Education Leadership page, that's where once the recordings are uploaded, they will be found there. And over here in this section of the agenda, you'll just see in red letters, like recording starts at 9 minutes, 6 seconds. And that's to try to just help you find that exact part of that recording without having to look through the whole thing. So sometimes maybe you say, oh, I really want to share this with my school psychs back in my district, and just this section, no, not the whole part. So then you don't have to try to do that. So just for your ease, if there are other things that you say, hey, I wish you would, or could you, just send them our way. Our team meets on a regular basis to plan the topics and think about how we're disseminating the information afterwards. So if there are other things that are helpful to you, please just share them with us. We're happy to take that feedback. There's a calendar that if you came to our new director academy, if you're new and came in August to an in-person session, you already saw this, but we thought we would share it for everybody else. So it's the 25-26 special education calendar. If you see errors, or if you say, hey, it'd be really helpful if you included this on the calendar, please, although we work on it as a collective RSN group, and Ignatowski from CISA 1 and I will be the contact people to accept that feedback. And then there is also a link so that you can add it right into your Google Calendar or your iCalendar. So Apple or Google, you take that link and you can add it. So when you open your calendar, you can just click on the 25-26 special education calendar, and all of this will populate as well onto that for you. As you can see, we have it broken down by month, and we've hyperlinked where we can. Some things like the Wise Grants didn't open when we thought it would or when it was typical. So some of that, we don't always go back and readjust it, but we know that we received information on that. So we hope this is a helpful tool. If you want to add your own things, and go ahead and make a copy. One thing that we spent quite a bit of time talking about at our new Director Academy that was in person was, now what local things also are you responsible for that you need to be cognizant of those dates? So if you want to make a copy of this, you're welcome to do so and then add your items in there locally. However, if we do make updates or changes, that doesn't carry over on the copy. So whatever works for you, but that resource is there for you as a tool. The other thing that I listed on the agenda here is just a resource guide. Um, we called it the New Director's Resource Guide. But it's kind of a link of multiple things, including the things we already talked about. We're going to hear from Lynn and Daniel shortly about our DPI reorganization, but currently it's still on DPI's webpage. So here are some special ed team members. Patty Williams is no longer the director of special ed, but that's still how it is listed on the webpage. When that is updated, I'll try to update this resource guide. Same with the Student
Oh,
Services Prevention and Wellness team.
we
Uh,
lost the option to sit out here. So now we're going to the
just
office.
wanted to let you know that those are there for you. Then we have, as Lindsay said, we are the Regional Special Education Network Directors. Hopefully you know who yours is in your CISA. However, all of us are listed here as well, including our email addresses, including Jen and Aaron, who are our fearless leaders of our group. Lindsay also stated that these new director academies or these leadership academies are co-hosted between DPI, WCAS, and the RSN. So I also included a link here to all of the WCAS board of directors and your regional reps. So even though WCAS they don't use the word CISA, they use the word region. If you are in CISA 1, you are in Region 1. If you are in CISA 10, you are in Region 10. So you can follow your region over, and then that is your regional rep, your local rep that can help you get connected to WCAS, help you answer some questions. Otherwise, those are the people that are on the board. The equity decision policy tool is linked here. That can be really helpful if you are, as you are thinking about policy or making decisions in your district, just to think through some questions. The calendar that I just shared is linked here. Special ed, as we all know, we have a ton of abbreviations and acronyms, so there's a list of some common ones there. A roles and responsibilities document that is published by WCAS. If you are in the results-driven accountability PCSA cycle, there's a link here. The Division of Learning Supports newsletter has changed to DPI Special Education. It's a weekly email from DPI. You can sign up if you're not receiving that by sending an email to this link, or if you see other links, you can click here and subscribe to other DPI listservs as well. Here's where you can find the folder of today's information and our followed up meetings to the rest of the year. Here's where you can find the registration and recordings. This is different than our calendar, but this is DPI's fiscal calendar year at a glance. So you can see like that the 1505 calendar, the days of hours of instruction when they're due. So that is listed there. And then if you're brand new, how to set up your WAMs, how to add users in the WISE application or approve users in that WISE application, and then how to access that special education portal. There is a hyperlink in the bottom, but it is in the footer, so you got to click on it to actually get to the top of the page. Not quite sure how to make that more user-friendly, but that's how it works for now. If you, again, have any suggestions or questions, reach out to either myself or Anne for the calendar, or I trust all of my RSN colleagues throughout the year that if you shared something with them, they will come back and say, hey, I got this really awesome suggestion. Would your team consider that? So your RSN, a WCAS rep, or yeah, any one of us. So thank you for giving me a little bit of time this morning.
Yeah. Thank you, Tracy, for those resources. Those are very helpful. And I would encourage you, if you haven't tried adding that special education calendar to your own calendar in the past, give it a try. I've found that you can turn it on and off, so it's not like you have to have it visible all the time, but it is kind of one of those good reminders. I like to look at it at the start of each month and kind of see what's coming up and then turn it off. But that is a great resource. The other piece that I just wanted to reiterate was the link that Tracy shared just below the Special Education Weekly Update, where you can subscribe to any listserv. This was new last year. So you can go in now, if you haven't done this already, you can actually go in, you can see which listservs you're subscribed to, and then subscribe to others
Lindsay, I
as you see
really
fit.
hate to interrupt you,
Is
but
that not correct?
well, when I double checked all the links, now it just says enter the email to the listserv you'd like to subscribe.
Oh,
I
shoot.
know, I know.
Okay.
We were so excited about that last year. So I have
Yes.
to find out if that feature can come back. But that's why I did not highlight that the same way we did last year because it's not quite functioning that way right now, and I'm not sure why.
Okay.
But you just have to enter an email address there. It doesn't show you what you're subscribed to and all
Shoot.
of them that are available. I know, big bummer.
Okay. Well, I apologize. Forget I
Thanks for
said
sharing
that.
the bummer news on a Wednesday morning.
Yeah, yeah, that was a great feature. Okay, so as Tracy had mentioned, there's some reorganization going on in the Department of Public Instruction, and that is our next set of speakers. So Lynn Wynn and Daniel Parker are joining us from, it looks like they are on, awesome. So they are joining us from DPI, and they will be going over some DPI updates. Welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. It's good to be here. I'm Lynn. I am formerly Assistant Director on the Special Education team at DPI, and under the reorganization, I am now the Director of the Office for Continuous Improvement. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means after Daniel has an opportunity to introduce himself and share some overarching information. Daniel?
Yeah, thank you, Lynn. Uh, Welcome, everyone. I'm Daniel Parker. I am also formerly an assistant director on the special education team. I am now a section leader in the. Okay. I just got back from vacation, then I was sick, so I have to remember all this stuff. I am a section leader in the Bureau of Teaching and Learning in the student engagement section. So as you may have heard through the grapevine or know, in June 2025, DPI implemented an agency-wide reorganization, and it was a major reorganization of our department. This reorganization was aligned with our strategic plan. We can drop that link into the chat at some point, but it is available on the DPI webpage, the strategic plan that we have for DPI. So we reorganized the entire department. Basically, one way to think about this is we moved away from a division and teams structure to a structure that is more comparable to other state agencies like Department of Health Services or Division of Vocational Rehabilitation, other agencies that have more of a division, bureau, office, section, unit type of structure. So DPI used to have that structure several decades ago. They moved to a division and team structure. We are now moving back to that bureau, office, section type of structure. With that realignment, the special education team moved from a single team structure into more of a horizontal teaming structure across the agency. So what that means is they put people with kind of job-alike types of special education, Individuals with Disability Education Act types of responsibilities within office bureaus or sections that have similar expertise in other areas outside of special education and IDA. So like to give you some examples of how these new divisions, office bureaus, and sections look, pretty much all of the special education team, former special education team, not all, but most are now still in the same division. We're all in the division of academics with Josh Robinson as our assistant state superintendent. Those folks that we're doing our state complaints and dispute resolution and our monitoring work Those are still led by Sarah Okonkwo, who's formerly an assistant director with Lynn and I on the special education team. They're in a new section called Dispute Resolution System and Compliance Monitoring section, and they're in a bureau with folks that do other types of fiscal monitoring, like such as for other federal and state types of grants. Those working in specific disability level expertise, those were the folks that I supported. So those with disability category criteria types of expertise, early childhood. Most of those folks are now in a student engagement section, working alongside of other folks doing things like early childhood, alternative education, American Indian and Indigenous learning, student learning. And then the special education personnel who specialize in supporting continuous improvement efforts of school districts are working with Lynn in the new Office of Continuous Improvement. We had some folks with fiscal responsibilities or special education data types of work are working with other folks that are doing fiscal type of work or data collection and evaluation type of work in various offices or sections in our division. And then I also note that we have the folks that are doing our family engagement work. There's a new Office of Family Engagement that works directly under one of the deputy state superintendents in our new reorganization in the Office of Family Engagement. And they do a lot of our work with like Wisconsin Statewide Parent Educator Initiative and other family engagement related grants funded through our IDA funding. So, you know, when this reorganization occurred, we immediately started having conversations and meetings about how do we continue all the work we're continuing to do, because it pretty much, it doesn't apply to everyone, but most everyone has the same or very similar positions from our previous team. We're just in different locations in the agency. So we've been meeting regularly to look at this horizontal structure, how it's going to continue to move forward, and just to kind of let folks know for example, anytime, you know, all the special education web pages are still special education web pages. They may say special education instead of special education team. The contact button still routes people to the same people that were answering the phones before. The customer service work that we do, I was the supervisor for our customer service work group. And we have a number of consultants and administrative professionals, and we have a very complex routing system where we also engage with our compliance content consultants for more challenging questions. All of those systems are exactly the same from prior to the reorganization. So nothing's changed in terms of how calls are routed, who answers the phone, who gets routed, what questions. All of that is still the same. And same with the web pages. We're all working together to maintain those and keep them updated, and so that information to the public remains the same. You know, we're continuing with other of the main functions of our department, again, are just continuing just in a new structure. I will also say that we still have very strong relationships also with our Wisconsin Educational Services Program for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, the Wisconsin Center for the Blind and Visually Impaired, and the Wisconsin Deafblind Technical Assistance Center. The folks that work through those DPI kind of arms are in a new division, but I actually just left a meeting with them to come here. We were working on a resource document for sensory disability, but we still work closely with everyone, even those that are outside of our division. So that's kind of a big, broad overview, and I will turn over to Lynn to kind of pick up some pieces I may have missed and to add to some of the work that she is doing.
Thanks, Daniel. I'm seeing one question in the chat. It says, any way we could condense the 48-page reorg document to specific contacts so we don't have to dig through 48 pages?
So an update on that, one of the things that I requested and we drafted out was the special education team staff listing webpage. has all of the people that work on the special education team. They all still have the same emails, they have the same phone numbers. I drafted what a reorg of that would look like, and it'll just say special education contacts, and it has everyone in their new locations and separated by their new locations. So that is being worked on by one of our communications folks in our division of academics. But I expect that to be updated in the next week or so if it's not already been updated. So we will have that.
Thanks, Daniel. The other big picture thing I would mention before we get to why I'm here is that the agency is in the process of identifying who will serve as our state director of special education. So that used to be Patty Williams. Patty has shifted her role within the organization, within the reorganization, and we are hopefully just a few weeks away from being able to identify who will take on the role or the responsibilities of State Director of Special Education for DPI very soon. Now, one of the offices that Daniel referred to within the organizational structure is the Office for Continuous Improvement. That is a new structure, brand new for our organization, and it matters for a couple of reasons. Number one, the work of the Regional Special Education Network falls within now the Office of Continuous Improvement, formerly in the Special Education team, now within the Office of Continuous Improvement. I cannot tell you how happy I am that I still get to support the work of the RSN within the reorganization. So in terms of who's supporting that work, that has not changed. Maybe location and title, but not the actual body of work and how it's being supported. The Office of Continuous Improvement was created out of a recognition that, number one, the value of high quality continuous improvement. And for the purposes of the Office of Continuous Improvement, we've brought together the folks who were supporting schools and districts that are federally identified under ESSA or IDEA. So the ESSA support for federal identifications used to fall within the Title I team, and the IDEA federal identifications fell within the special education team. And we worked really hard to try and make that structure work. And I think this reorganization is going to provide us with opportunities to create consistencies and efficiencies that we were not able to accomplish under the previous organization. I'm very excited about that. The other awesome connection around that is that all of the Regional Special Education Network folks are also members of their Technical Assistance Network teams within each CISA. And we call it the TA network. Each CISA has a TA network, which is a DPI funding supported group of people within each CISA whose role is to support those schools and districts with federal identifications under ESSA or IDEA in implementing high quality continuous improvement for the strategies that they've selected to improve upon outcomes for kids with a number of identities. So previously, we were focused primarily on kids with IEPs. Interestingly enough, oftentimes the kids with IEPs that were informing identifications under IDEA were also the same kids informing a number of the identifications under ESSA, under TSI, ATSI, and CSI. So all that to say, we have the opportunity now to support districts and schools in a new and better way that I'm very excited about. I'm going to share with you the formal purpose of the Office of Continuous Improvement. So I'm going to read it so I don't screw it up. It is to support the use of research-based continuous improvement of the effective implementation of evidence-based improvement strategies aligned to root causes for schools and districts that are identified under ESSA or IDEA. So I didn't start with that because it's a lot of jargon. It really is about creating a system of supports for schools and districts that are federally identified. The great thing about this is that once we attend to those schools and districts we've identified as being most in need, which are those with federal identifications, what we create is going to benefit every school and district in the state. So our goal is to build it with those with the greatest need in mind, because we know through UDL principles that when you do that, what you create benefits everyone. So that's the Office of Continuous Improvement. If you have any questions, if you are here representing a school or a district that has a federal identification, and you haven't already, I would reach out to your RSN around how they can, through their TA network team representation, support you in those efforts. And my phone number hasn't changed. My email hasn't changed. So for those of you who are already familiar with me from the special education team, if there's anything I can do to support you at any time, please reach out. We're here to help. Thanks. Are there any questions, wonderings, curiosities, clarifications that Danielle or I could offer?
All right. I don't see anything in the chat right now. Did anyone have any questions that they wanted to pose? Okay. Well, thank you so much, Lynn and Danielle, and we'll stay tuned for those updates to the site. We are running a little bit ahead of schedule, but we are going to go ahead and take our morning break. So we will take a break now, and we will return at 9:45. So we'll see you all in about 15 minutes. All right, as we are returning from our break, we are going to move into some information about seclusion and restraint. And we are going to start by going over some Wisconsin revised guidance. This guidance was actually revised in June of 2020. So the Wisconsin State Statute on Seclusion and Restraint was revised in June of 2020. But we had lots of things going on in education in June of 2020. And because of that, it maybe got lost in the shuffle of all the things for people during the pandemic. So I am now going to be joined by two of my RSN colleagues, Rachel and Megan. And we are going to go over a frequently asked questions document that was just updated on the DPI website in August. Rachel and Megan, would you like to introduce yourselves?
I can jump in. Hi, everyone. I am Rachel Kotarabic from CISA 7, the RSN in Green Bay.
Good morning. I'm Megan Peterson, the RSN from CISA 12 in Ashland.
All right, and I will kick us off here. Are just some links to the resources, and the slide deck should be linked in our agenda. And certainly feel free to click on these links at will. And I would just share the disclaimer that we have on the bottom is that Lindsay, Megan, and I are all CPI trainers. And so some of the information that we share and that we've pulled is from our background as CPI trainers. But that is only one of the options for training your school staff. And the Department of Public Instruction and we as RSN do not necessarily promote one specific type of training over the other. That just happens to be the expertise in the area of training that we all have. So just a disclaimer to start everything off. Go ahead, Lindsay. So the first question that we chose to pull out of the FAQ really was, how does the law define the term covered individual? So something that Lindsay, Megan, and I agreed that we've heard from all of you as directors is, you know, who's covered in my school or how many people do I have to have trained? And so this was one that we wanted to pull out because, you know, we are kind of getting the question around how many people do we have to have trained because it's expensive, right? And so, you know, who should receive the training required by law regarding physical restraint? And the answer really is the law requires at least one staff member in each school where restraint might be used to be trained. The law does not specify particular staff member roles as requiring training, and schools should carefully consider which staff members should receive that training. So administrators, security or safety personnel, regular education staff, student services, special education staff should all be considered. And so I would ask you to consider when thinking about all of those roles, how large is your district? How close are your buildings within your campus? How many students that do you have that might be in crisis at any one given time, right? So those are all things to consider when you're thinking about covered individuals and the need for training. And so when I say that, certainly the district may wish to consider training several people, even though we really only have to have one staff member where restraint might be used. That being said, as I just said, it might be useful to have more than one trained person available to ensure the safety for students and staff alike. And so then from a CPI perspective, sorry, Lindsay, from a CPI perspective, we often do train that we want a staff or a team approach. Go ahead, Lindsay. And so then we talk a little bit about a crisis team. And so a crisis team is really to minimize the severity of risk and behavior by intervening in a way that keeps an individual in crisis and others safe. And so when we think about that, we really want to think about, what is a crisis team and what is not. And so it's not a group or an individual that's brought in to enforce a rule, right? Or to ensure that a student completes a task or a directive, right? So we're not just enforcing things, and we don't want them just removing a student from a space. They really are there to respond, hopefully as proactively as possible, and they are trained in safe ways to manage risk behavior. And so when we talk about risk behavior, those are really what I would define as imminent danger, right? Danger to themselves or others when a crisis has happened. And so when we think about that, they are committed to evaluating each crisis situation and its context using the lowest level of intervention possible. And if and when we would need to use a physical restraint, we want to use it for the least amount of time possible. And so crisis teams look different at each building, at each district, the number of people and who's on it and what that might look like and how they're called for. But here are some considerations that we have. And so we want to give you a moment to just read over these considerations. And so I'll give an example. When I was working in one of the elementary schools, we used to say over the loudspeaker when a student was in crisis that we had an I team. So a student was in crisis and we would say I team to Mrs. So-and-so's classroom. And while that was really effective in getting the team to go to the classroom, that also let all the other students and the student in crisis know that the intervention team was coming to that classroom. So we had to really be mindful about, was that the best way? And so we decided that maybe that wasn't the best way, and just letting people know through our walkie-talkies was a better way of doing that. Because for some students, having 4 or 5 people descend upon them isn't the best way of doing business, right? We had to define a point person, right? So when the crisis team came, who was going to be the first person to interact with the student, or if they were the first, then who was going to continue the conversation? Maybe who was going to be the observer, who was going to be the recorder. All of those kinds of things are really important when you're thinking about a crisis team, especially for what I would consider my frequent flyers, right? Those students that happen to be in crisis more often than other students. And then, how are we building staff capacity? When are we taking time to debrief, especially for students who might be in crisis more than others? And so what we want to give you now is some time in some random breakout rooms to have a conversation about, does your school or district have a crisis team? What does it look like? Who is on it? Thinking about those questions that I just had, or that we just had on that considerations page, we want you to have a conversation and share in your building or district what that looks like for you. And this is the time where you get to big, borrow, and steal, right? So what does it look like for you? Or ask questions of your colleagues, right? Like, what's going well? What's not going well? If wishes were fishes, what would you implement if you could? So I believe Jen is going to put you in some random breakout rooms and possibly put those considerations into the chat for you. And we're only going to give you about 5 or 6 minutes in breakout rooms to just have a conversation around your crisis teams, and whether you have them or not, or things that you've considered, things that have gone well, or things that you really wish you could have. Lindsay or Megan, anything to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in. We did a CPI training at CISA 10 yesterday, and one of the things that we discussed with the folks that were present was um, certainly the ways in which your crisis team can help ensure safety within your building or district, but then also the ways in which you don't want your crisis team to contribute to any sort of a reputation or a story that is told about a particular student or a group of students. And so that might be something else to talk about is in what ways do you ensure student confidentiality? In what ways do you ensure that the student is set up for success and you're not contributing to potentially damaging relationships with other students or future staff that they might have in another grade? That was another good discussion here yesterday. So one other piece that might go right with this discussion about crisis.
And I do see in the chat, someone put in our SROs excluded from being considered part of the crisis team. I think that's a really good discussion. I've had districts that have had them part of the crisis team. And I've also had districts say, I do not want them part of the crisis team because I'd rather have them be seen only in a positive light. And so I really don't want them unless it's a major crisis and we have to call them, and or I really only want them having positive interactions with the student. So that really is a discussion that I think you should have within your breakout rooms or within your school or district. Lindsay, something else you were going to add?
I was just going to say, in a little bit after this breakout room, we're going to talk about some reporting requirements that go along with having an SRO be involved in these types of situations.
So Jen, whenever you are ready, you can certainly open breakout rooms.
Okay, we will open them now and remind me how much time?
5 minutes, please.
Okay, here we go.
Pause the recording.
Stairs.
Welcome back. I'm in a room with other people, and so I got the pleasure of listening into a breakout room, and it was a great conversation. So I hope that's how other conversations went. If you happen to notice your room number, I'm gonna just call out 2 or 3 room numbers, and just if you could just summarize your conversation, or a main point of your conversation or a question of your conversation, we would appreciate it. So room 3, if somebody could unmute and just, what was a big takeaway from the conversation you had? If you knew that you were in room 3.
That might have been my room. Sorry. I can jump in and share. One of the big conversations, we talked a lot about kind of like the different names and the different roles other team members, crisis team members might have. And so everyone had a variation of it in some way, shape, or form, but just really named something and also used in other capacities as well.
Thank you, Erica. If you were in room 7.
Rachel, I'm not sure what room I was in, but I will share what was shared in our room. We did talk about we had a wide variety of size of district and approaches. All of them had a crisis team. All of the districts that were in the group. There was discussion around SROs being utilized in crisis group, and for the preponderance of individuals, SROs are not utilized in that capacity. All of the teams shared that they were using some type of regulation strategies with students, and that their team members were trained in that. And actually was able to take down some information that other folks had used. One of the districts shared that they have first, when the crisis team is called, they send a student identified safe adult to the crisis first before calling in the rest of the team. I thought that was a beautiful strategy. So that was a big takeaway for me.
Thanks so much, Kari. I really appreciate that. And I wish we could hear from more, but we do need to keep going. And just some really great discussion. I did drop the parking lot link in the chat again. So if some questions came up in your breakout room that you want to drop in for the planning team or for Tim and Eva at the DPI, certainly feel free to put them in the parking lot. But I am going to toss this over to Megan to keep going on this morning's presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rachel. One of the other questions that when
Brian and Shelley, period. This
we're
is the
going through the FAQ document and thinking about what are some things that people have really reached out about and maybe had some extra questions about was does the law apply to private schools as well? As you can see from the slide, from what we pulled out of the document, yes, the law does apply to all private schools that participate in the special needs scholarship program and applies to private schools where public school IEP teams place students. Remember that when an IEP team places a student at a private school, right, the IEP team, the public school districts remain responsible for FAPE. And that includes the reporting of seclusion restraint, as well as all the information, rules, regulations within the statute regarding seclusion and restraint. So when we're going over all of this information, those are the two times that it would apply to private schools as well.
And thinking about your role as a director, thinking about how those communications occur, especially if you have students that are placed in a setting, perhaps it was behaviorally driven placement, so that it's more likely that something like this might be occurring in that setting. You know, what is the vehicle for conversation, regular conversation with that school? How do you know that they are following the same guidelines as you, as well as how do you know when those incidents have occurred so that you can include that data with your data that you report?
And ideally, that communication is happening throughout the school year and not simply right before we need that information for the reporting to the school board. So we will have some time in our next breakout to discuss that with our groups. And I see there is a question in the chat too. I need to get down to it. Parentally placed private school students. Lindsay, were you going to jump in?
Yeah, so the reporting, so it's kind of two separate pieces. So reporting piece, when an IEP team has placed a student in a district, that it's still your student, right? You've just placed them elsewhere. So in that situation, they're included with the numbers for the public school district, the reporting piece. The parentally placed private school students would not be included in a school district's numbers for seclusion and restraint. However, if that particular agency was a part of the special needs scholarship program, then they would be bound by the same rules and regulations as the public school district, if that makes sense.
All righty. This is probably one of the biggest questions that we get. And kind of going back to our roles as CPI trainers, one of the, at least in my experience over the last 4 years, one of the biggest questions we get and scenarios people would like to talk through during our training sessions as well. And that is, what about when a student is destroying the classroom and destroying any sort of property, right? What if they're smashing Chromebooks? What if they're taking all the water bottles from all the students' desks after the classroom has been cleared of other students and dumping them all over? They're tipping tables, ripping up books, all that property damage, which as you're watching, you're realizing is going to cost a lot of money and is going to cause a lot of upset when the other students come back really as well, right? But the answer is no. Property damage alone, right? Just the property damage is not sufficient enough of a reason for the use of physical restraint or seclusion, right? However, were it to move to the point of there being imminent or immediate danger to that student's self or others, then that would be a risk assessment that would need to be made at that time, right? As we're thinking about it, we also need to make sure that we're really thinking about whether this is a real, imminent, and immediate, right, risk of significant harm, or are we just thinking this could be, right? Or were somebody to be looking at this, might it be? We're always thinking in every decision point of whether the risk of what we may do as an intervention, will that cause more harm than the risk of the behavior that's being done? And whenever we use any sort of physical restraint or seclusion, there is definite risk of harm to the student or the staff members who are performing that restraint or seclusion. This one is very difficult a lot of times for people to work through, because it's not easy to watch a student destroy property, especially if the property is something that is important to someone, like bulletin boards that have taken a really long time, or door decorations or other students' material. Yeah, and I see a note from CISA 7 group, absolutely. The risk of doing something versus the risk of doing nothing, right? We always want to consider the unintended consequences and keeping trauma in mind, 100%.
There's also a question coming up in the chat about districts' overuse of seclusion and restraint, and then just districts wondering and being fearful because they're not advising staff to seclude or restraint as staff are becoming injured and so forth. So just wondering whether this group would comment on that at some point, or DPI, because that's a wonder that's coming.
Sure. Thank you, Brenda.
Absolutely. Yeah, I believe the DPI group, that will be the focus of their conversation right after this. So we're going to get through these frequently asked questions, and then we'll be joined by the folks that will be talking about safe ways to reduce instances of seclusion and restraint, as well as some resources that are available to districts and some new reporting that they have.
Sure. Does the law allow the use of physical restraint or oh, sorry, I'm on the wrong slide here. Are bus harnesses or other vehicle safety restraints permitted under the law? Yes. The use of vehicle restraints when used as intended, right? So seat belts in a school van, because the seat belts are part of that van, that and such things like 5-point harnesses are not considered restraint. However, I get notes here in the slide, for a student with a disability, the use of any safety equipment or any specific considerations or say really considerations about how things might be used or extra plans that need to be in place around those, such as maybe a plan for a student who consistently is unbuckling their seatbelt. That should be included and documented in the IEP, but not as a restraint. I believe we had a question, yeah, about if it's a student without a disability. Remember that the information in this FAQ notes that this law, and so everything included, applies to all students, both with and without disabilities. So I'm not sure. We are, unless there's any really specific questions around that, we will be going into another breakout room. We will be asking for some thoughts and points that you considered when you get back from a couple breakout rooms. So if you have a piece of paper next to you or somewhere to just note down which breakout room you're going in, sometimes that's helpful. So that if you get called on, you know where you were. We have three. Go ahead, Lindsay.
Before you go to breakout rooms, I just wanted to address one more question that was in the chat that said, can we clarify what has been updated in the frequently asked questions? And so the statute has not changed since June of 2020. So the content is similar to the previous version of the frequently asked questions. The previous version was a side-by-side of the old statute and the new statute in a table, and it had kind of a nice layout, or in my opinion, a nice layout of what was in the statute before and what had changed in the statute. The new revision of the frequently asked questions is in question form. So it has a lot more, I think there's benefit to both versions. The new frequently asked questions is much more scenario based. So when you open the frequently asked, I'm just gonna, since I know we have just a moment, I want to go back here and just open it up so that I can show you. The updated webpage on the DPI site for seclusion and physical restraint is very nicely organized. Down here at the bottom, it now is categorizing resources by category. I don't want to steal the thunder from our next group, so I'm sure they're going to talk about this, but lots of great resources that are categorized by topic. And then right above that, you can see the PDF for the frequently asked questions. And what's nice about this update, once we load here, is that it captures a lot of the very specific scenarios that lots of questions were coming up about. So, for example, if a student is placed in a small room to either work on schoolwork or take a break, would this be considered seclusion? So it's just formatted in a way that's more scenario based, if that makes sense.
Sure. And so,
yeah.
Lindsay, I'm sorry, did you have any? Oh, so as we go out into our breakout rooms, if you haven't clicked on that link already to use as a reference and resource, and as you have your discussions, please do so. We have three questions that for you to focus on during this time. You can either try to touch on all of them in your breakout room, or if there's one that your group really wants to focus on and dive deep into, that works as well. So the first question is around, do you have students in your district for whom transportation with safety equipment such as a harness is utilized? Okay, maybe what does that look like within the IEP? Is it a student with an IEP, or it sounds like we have students who do not have IEPs as well. What does that look like? Our second question, again, usually the big one, how does your building or district currently handle situations of property damage? And then big question around here too is, what ways do you have room to grow in your practice? Or do you think, nope, we're perfect already? Never know. All right. And then the last question is, does your district have students in private schools? is seclusion and restraint a consideration for those students? And if so, what is your method for ensuring that your seclusion and restraint numbers are reported with your public school data? And I'm going to insert in there as well, how do you communicate with that school or schools throughout the year? So it isn't just information you are getting right before you need to report to the school board.
Yeah.
All right. Jen, I believe, is going to put you back into breakout rooms. And we will give you a bit more time since we have a lot for you to discuss here. I think at least 10 minutes for this, if not a few minutes more.
Okay. All right, rooms are opening.
No way.
Okay, looks like we have pretty much everyone back. Let's see, let's have 2 breakout rooms share out. Let's start with room 15. If somebody in that group noted that they were in breakout room 15.
I was in group 15. We talked about a little bit more about the property damage, and we had some good conversations about different policies. We talked about who pays for the items. And 2 of us said that like we reimburse or we pay for it out of our budget if it's directly related to the disability. One school doesn't do that, they bill families, which obviously can create some contentious conversations. So I mean, we just talked about that. A big thing is like educating people about it and making them remember that it's okay that you can like replace and you can fix items, but you can't like fix or replace a person or the experiences they have. And I think that education piece is so important because I'm learning a lot of staff don't realize why I'm not putting my hands on a kid because I don't want to put myself in that situation because I don't need to. I'll just replace the computer. I'll just replace the toolbox. It's not the end of the world. And so I think just educating all staff so that they don't think that we're not doing anything, but like realizing that we're just doing our due diligence and making sure this kid is safe.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing. How about group 12? Anybody know that they were?
Yeah, that was us. I'll talk. We, so it was my question originally about a regular ed student, 4K student on a bus. Could they be in use with a 5-point harness? And it sounds like, Megan, based on what you said about the FAQs and the law, that would actually be okay. Based on the fact that what he would be doing without the 5-point harness would be a lot less safe and much more chaotic than if he was actually safe and seated. So we talked about that. We talked about private school students. We had more questions. How do we track that data reliably? And are we responsible for what happens at the private and parochial sites? If they use seclusion and restraint, are we responsible for what's happening there?
Okay. Thank you for sharing. I think those are some good questions to put in our parking lot and also see if maybe our next presenters address or can address.
And certainly that area that would be most most likely, if nothing else, a shared responsibility with the district would be when a student has been placed, somewhere. But I agree. There are many more questions than answers that come up in those scenarios, because certainly we don't necessarily have control over their staff's training or experiences or policies and procedures. So, just one of those, another very difficult question to answer when we're considering an offsite placement. Yep, and somebody else is also saying, how are private schools communicating with LEAs regarding seclusion and restraint incidents? That's again, it's a system. One way to set up that system would be at the start of the year when you're going over, your kind of working agreements for the year, setting up, establishing whatever method of communication. But it is going to be important that that communication is occurring since, again, if an IEP team is placing a student, then we are still responsible for FAPE and the same guidelines still apply. And one of those guidelines that we're actually going to mention momentarily here is for a student with an IEP, we do need to be reconvening the IEP team when seclusion and restraint is occurring. So there, it is important to make sure that we have a method of communication so that we know when that has happened. Also, a note from Amy that I thought was great is, it's important to note that you don't have to just watch a student destroy a room, right? So considering environmental factors, what can be removed from reach quickly, supportive strategies, and language.
Absolutely.
Okay, I am going to shift. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just
Nope.
noting that is
Nope.
an excellent addition and absolutely.
Okay. I am going to we made a decision during the last breakout room. Instead of going back to our slides, we're going to go straight to the resource, and we're still going to highlight the pieces that we wanted to highlight, but do it right in the document so that you can see where that is, given that there were some questions coming up about the resource itself. So this is that frequently asked questions document. It was revised August 5th, 2025. So just very recently. Does have a table of contents on the front, which is nice. And I'm just going to kind of go over the structure of the document, and then as we go, I'll highlight the pieces that we had left in our slide deck. So this first section has lots of definitions. It talks about who's covered. It even has a statement right here under what limited circumstances does the law permit school staff to use seclusion or physical restraint with a student? So the law permits the use of physical restraint or seclusion only in circumstances where a student's behavior presents a clear, present, and imminent risk to the physical safety of the student or others, and physical restraint or seclusion is the least restrictive intervention feasible. So certainly, I think that's something that most of us are familiar with, but there is a statement right out there. If you're having conversations in teams in your district and somebody's saying, well, but this child is little, why can't I just pick them up and move them? This would be a good reference point. Here's the question about property damages just below that we've already covered. Next is a section on seclusion. It talks about the definition of seclusion, talks about what does it mean when they say physically prevented from leaving, like what are they talking about when they say that? This is one of the statute changes that had occurred with that most recent statute change. Again, we're talking about 5 years ago that statute changed. But it used to be that you couldn't have a door locked, and now the statute actually states that it cannot have a lock. So if you have a space that's indicated, its usage is indicated for seclusion, that door should not have a lock. Scenario based here, may staff hold a door shut so it doesn't have a lock? Are we able to hold it shut? It talks about how you would assess that on a case-by-case basis. Some more scenario things. What about when you're clearing other students from a room, sending them to the hallway or principal's office, working in a smaller space? Then we move on to a section about physical restraint. Again, a definition, the legal definition of physical restraint. Talks about mechanical restraints, chemical restraints, prone physical restraints, all dangerous things, right? Things that are not permissible under law. Here is the section about bus harnesses and vehicle safety restraints. So if that was a continuing conversation in your group, this is where you can refer to that. Then talks about weighted blankets and other sensory tools. So, similar to the seatbelts, weighted equipment used properly for sensory support under the direction and oversight of appropriate medical or therapeutic staff. Sometimes we have like an occupational therapist that might be putting together a sensory plan for a student, for example. Those sensory supports, if used in the intended manner, would not be considered a restraint. Question that always comes up, does this mean that we can never touch a student, right? Now, certainly there are a million factors you would take into account before you touch a student in any way. Keeping in mind potential trauma that's occurred in the child's past or, power dynamics, all kinds of things. But may staff redirect students by touch? Absolutely. So touching or holding a student's hand, arm, shoulder, or back to calm, comfort, or redirect the student is not considered physical restraint. Only when staff members immobilize or restrict the ability of a student to freely move is the maneuver considered physical restraint. So, it's not to say that we can never touch a student for any reason, right? Um, then the next section moves into the IEP requirements. So when a student is secluded or restrained for the second time in a given school year, the IEP team must reconvene within 10 days of that incident. And what the IEP team is doing is they're talking about what proactive strategies do we have in place? What do we know about this behavior that's leading to this seclusion or restraint? And what proactive strategies do we have in place? Are those strategies included in the student's IEP? Okay, so we're getting together and we're making a plan for the student and making sure we have some proactive strategies in place that is part of the IEP. A follow-up question, so does this mean we have to meet after the second and the fourth and the sixth, etc.? No. So the requirement to reconvene the IEP team is after the second incident. However, if this truly was occurring over and over and over, it certainly begs the question, is there something that we can revise or change or something more proactive we can put in place to prevent this from occurring again in the future? Down here at the bottom, this was a statutory change at the time the statute changed. So are there circumstances that require an IEP to specifically describe the use of physical restraint or seclusion? Okay, because there used to be, correct? So it says no, 2019 Act 118 repealed the section of the law, including the requirement for IEPs to incorporate the use of the term seclusion or physical restraint in a student's IEP if the IEP team determines their use could be reasonably anticipated. As such, IEP teams are no longer required to determine whether the use of restraint or seclusion is anticipated, and the IEP is not required to contain these terms. If you think about how we write IEPs in every other area of support for a student, we're writing the things that were put in place to promote success. Seclusion or restraint is a last choice intervention and a response to a crisis behavior. And the types of supports and strategies we would put in place to promote student success are those things that would be more proactive. So, environmental supports, understanding different patterns and triggers for a student, etc. And so really putting the emphasis on what are we doing to support the students so that they are successful, so that they're not falling into crisis, would really be the focus of that IEP piece, as opposed to just saying, well, if they get to this point, we're going to seclude or restrain, right? That's kind of a given, in the sense that any student, right, that was in crisis, that was in danger of injuring themselves or someone else, there is a potential that seclusion or restraint could be utilized in that situation. All right. Then this final section relates to debriefing requirements. This is something else that was not as clearly articulated in the previous iteration of the statute. So must school staff meet to debrief after each incident? Yes. And that ultimately that falls on the building principal's responsibility to ensure that that happens, but it might be somebody else, depending on the situation, depending on your building and your structure and how you kind of run that crisis team. But you are debriefing after each incident. There is no specific written form, but there are, this examples link we're going to ask when our friends are on here in a bit does not seem to be taking you to examples right now. However, we have an example that we can share, and hopefully they can get that back up and working. Another change in the statute, our schools are required to provide parents a copy of the incident report. It used to be that they were not, they just had to have it available. But now schools are required to provide parents a copy of that incident report. This talks about reporting of data. And then finally, I wanted to touch on this question right here because it was coming up quite a bit. Does restraint or seclusion by a police officer need to be documented and reported? We all, I'm sure, have been in situations where when the officer comes in, we tap out and that's that, right? However, this statute revision does require schools to document, notify parents, and report all incidents involving law enforcement officers. However, law enforcement officers are not covered individuals under the law, so the other provisions about seclusion and physical restraint do not apply to them. So, I know that earlier somebody had asked a question saying, do we follow the guidance? If a law enforcement officer is telling us to do something, I would say that that law enforcement officer is going to act in line with the training that they've received. And if that's not in line with the training that you've received about safe seclusion or restraint, I would have some conversations within your district and between your district and the law enforcement in your area about asking staff to perhaps do something that is not in line with their training or the mismatch between those two agencies' trainings. But if seclusion or restraint by an officer occurs on your school site, that is bound to the same debrief and reporting requirements as if it had occurred with any other staff member. All right. How are we looking for time, John? Do we do one last? Oops, I see a question in the chat
right now.
Okay, question in the chat. For students with medical restrictions, for example, no weight bearing, if they cannot follow doctor's orders or restrictions due to their disability, is buckling them in their wheelchair in an effort to prevent weight bearing considered restraint? My initial thought is I'd want to know a little more about that specific situation. Like, are we buckling them in against their will? Are we buckling them in? I mean, if it's a safety mechanism that's built into that piece of medical equipment that they've been prescribed, that seems like that would be probably an acceptable use of that piece of safety equipment. But perhaps if it's perhaps being used in a way that the student could injure themselves because they're resisting it, I guess I would be hesitant to do that without having a larger conversation, with the family and the medical provider and making a plan for that. All right.
There are several questions in the chat and the parking lot. I'm just going to kind of scooch backwards from where we are currently in the chat. If we want to just take maybe 3 more minutes for questions and then a 10-minute break.
Sure. Yeah.
Travis asked if DPI has a recommended debriefing tool. And Rachel, I want to just confirm that what you put in the chat is a suggested example or, okay.
Yeah, that is just an example of a reporting tool. And because we don't have links in the form from DPI, this is something that one of our CISAs uses. So certainly not an exemplar, just an example. Feel free to use it if you don't currently have one in your district, or adapt it as it meets your needs. But just an example of something that you could use.
Yeah. And actually, right in the frequently asked questions, they state that they do not have a suggested reporting tool. They just have examples. Yeah.
I'll put in one more question. I'm not sure. So this is about the weighted vest. If there's a student using a weighted vest that is not under supervision of a qualified staff member, would this be considered a mechanical restraint? This might be something we have to pass on to our next speakers, but
Yeah.
Yeah, I would be interested to hear their take on that. Again, I think it would have to do with context and like what is the purpose of the utilization of that? And if it is to keep the student in one place or restrict their movement in some way, then I think that's a different conversation than a student choosing to use. I know sometimes students choose to use a weighted blanket while they're reading a book or choose to,
Right.
hold a heavy stuffed animal to calm down, and that would be a totally different situation.
Okay, we're coming up on 10:50, so we have been putting all of your questions in the parking lot. So as we transition to our next group of speakers, we'll peck away at that list as well. I'm going to guess that some of what they have to say will answer some of those questions, but we'll for sure, if we don't answer it today, like we've said, the parking lot, we will make sure to get an answer documented in there. So we're taking questions from the chat and putting them in there so we can make sure that everybody gets an answer. I want to thank Lindsay and Megan and Rachel for your presentation and your time today. This is always a question on the minds of districts, so I think this is a very very timely topic. It is 10:50. Our next speakers are due at 11 o'clock, so let's take our second break for the day, and we will return at 11.
A short break. And I see Eva Shaw and Tim Pierenboom on my screen, and I'm not sure if perhaps you have someone else with you as well. Oh, yep, I see Sarah as well. So Sarah Totten, Eva Shaw, and Tim are all on now. So I guess for the good of the group, what we were doing was taking a little bit of a closer look and having some breakout room conversations about the frequently asked questions document on seclusion and restraint that was updated just in August. And I think it's maybe good to know that for some of the participants on the screen today, those statutory changes that occurred back about 5 years ago are new still, or are things that were being discussed kind of systematically for the first time today. So just so that you're aware, we have been receiving a lot of questions, so trying to add those to our parking lot. But welcome, and we are happy to.
All right, thank you. I think you cut off, so I hope you got to say everything you were wanting to. I'm Sarah. I work with DPI. This is my third year working with the department. I work mostly on IDEA complaints, but I also do a little bit of PCSA reviews and seclusion and restraint and some things with IEP forms. Prior to coming to DPI, I was a director of student services and special ed for 12 years. And prior to that, I was a school psychologist. And then I'll turn it over to Eva to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Eva Shaw. I'm a special education consultant at DPI, and I've been with DPI about 5 years. And prior to that, I did just about everything that you can think of related to special ed. I taught in full inclusion and self-contained settings. I did diagnostic work and program support. I did administrative work. So everything special ed is my background, and I will pass it to Tim.
Morning, Tim Piermum. I'm the school psychology consultant at the Department of Public Instruction. Yeah, and in the interest of time, I think we'll just jump right in and get going. Quick question. Do we have access to that parking lot with the questions?
Let me put that in the chat for you right now.
Okay. We'll try and kind of keep an eye on that as we go through what we're going to talk about. And if we can sort of pick off some of the low-hanging fruit and ones that fit into our discussion today, we'll do that.
Are you switching slides for us, Tim? Oh, thank you. Okay, I'll just reference here. We did link in our seclusion and restraint webpage. there are a lot of resources there. Oh, that's the parking lot. Okay. So I've had some questions come forward about where can I find the root cause analysis tool, or where can I find the action plans? And if you end up going to our web pages, under the tools and resources section, you'll find a few different tools for root cause analysis, including like a fishbone tool, 5 whys. There's also then a copy of an action plan that you're welcome to use. However, if your district has your own plan that you're using, or your own template, that's totally fine too. Okay, and then if you want to go to the next slide, just a quick review of the timeline. So right now, your district administrator should have been sent the survey from DPI that typically then gets forwarded to directors. At least that was always my experience. The survey always went to the SOUP. The SOUP would forward it to me as the director, and I would enter our seclusion and restraint numbers. For this part, I just want to highlight too, if you have students in your district that are placed at alternative schools, you do need to work with that alternative school to report seclusion and restraint data from your student from that alternative site. The alternative schools also got a letter this year with that reminder and a few clarifications on how to report that data. Again, we're telling them to report that data to you specifically at the district level. Then the remaining dates are outlined there for you too, when you have to report to the board, when we send the next data file for folks to review, and then when notifications go out. We also added, I think it's added to our website, maybe, let me just double check. Maybe not yet. We are working on a group of all of our communications that go out, and so that you'll see all of those, and they will be linked on our website at some point here too. So you can, if you're forgetting a timeline, or you're forgetting like what a form said or where to go for something, that would all be on our webpage as well pretty soon on that seclusion and restraint page. Okay, and you can kind of skip over the next slide. We talked about that. Then moving on to the different levels. So your district should have gotten a letter about what level your district was on based on your numbers of seclusion and restraint. So we do have 3 levels of support. It's based on your number of incidents at the school levels, and it is separated by individual school in the district. This is previous school year data, so that leveling is based on that. And this is for just our public schools only. We don't do this for the private schools. Okay. Next slide. Okay, so for support level 1, these are schools with fewer than 100 incidents per 100 or per 1,000 students. So here, your participation as far as submitting an action plan or root cause or doing root cause analysis is optional. You're welcome to do that. Any one of us would be willing to look at those plans if you're wanting some feedback or support. So you'll see, again, consultation, coaching, and support is available through request. So not required, but if you want it, we're here. And then if you want to move on to the next slide, support level 2 is for districts that have had between 100 and 200 incidents of seclusion and restraint per 1,000 students. So here we are recommending that you do a root cause analysis and create an action plan and submit that for review. So if you're in level 2, you would have been notified again of this. You also would have been notified of which consultant you could submit that plan to. Again, we can provide consultations as you wish and support you however best fits your district needs. So again, that is still optional. However, we are kind of more strongly recommended if you're at level 2. And then if you're at level 3 on the next slide, we really, really strongly recommend that you submit a plan to us at this level. This was required last year. We've kind of backed off that requirement, sort of. So we do still encourage you to submit that plan. I think it's helpful for you as a district too. It avoids, we've had a lot of parent groups come forward. There's been some things in the newspapers over the past couple of years about our incidents of seclusion and restraint. And it really developing that action plan just demonstrates that you as a district are doing something about those numbers. And so again, this is not meant as just another add-on requirement for you. It's really meant to help with that problem solving, with the root cause analysis, really identifying and getting at, what is going on with those students if your district is needing support. Now, maybe you have that all figured out, and sometimes we find that as we get these plans, especially with the data being a year behind, a lot of times schools have already done some amazing things. They've already implemented some interventions, and those numbers are already lower by the time we identify the district. So sometimes this isn't needed, like that submission isn't needed, but just know we're here to support and help. And that's really the intent of this whole leveling system and the recommendations involved. Okay, next slide. And then Eva's going to talk to you a little bit more about the ES3 grants later. Again, if you need help with any of this, if you're not sure what level you're on, maybe you came to the district after the letters already came, we can definitely look that up for you. Just let one of us know if you have any questions along the way in that process, whether root cause analysis or action plan development, let us know. And with that, I think Tim is up next.
I am. Lindsay, when you say incidents from private schools, what are you referring to as far as private schools? Because there's lots of different versions of it.
Yeah. So I am referring to a student that was placed off-site at a school that I guess like an IEP team placement that would require us to include that data along with our own. I'm just curious, when you say that the leveling doesn't apply to private schools, I'm curious if those types of data do, however, factor into that leveling for a district.
Yeah, Eva, do we get to that when we get to yours? I don't know if we touch on that specifically or not, or should I just answer it right now?
I think go ahead. We don't specifically cover that.
Sure. Okay, so Sarah did mention, so when it's a private school, and I think I saw in the parking lot some questions about parentally placed private school students. If parents choose to put their child in a private school and they're just attending a private school, that's not an area of reporting for you all. If an IEP team places a student at what we refer to them as is alternative placements, as sort of a catch-all for schools that are like the CDEB schools, like Sybil Hop and Lakeland School, or other placements like Richardson schools, or places that are outside of your school district that sort of fall under this catch-all of alternative programs. So private school parents who choose to place their students in private schools, fine. The one caveat for private schools where they are required to do reporting is they do have to report to us seclusion and restraints that occur with students who attend their school under the special needs scholarship program. Okay, so that's private schools. Generally speaking, you don't need to worry about private schools unless it happens to be a private school that is one of these alternative placements where an IEP team places that student there. So the process there is that the alternative program, the alternative school, whatever it might be, should be reporting on students that your district places there. They should be reporting the number of incidents back to you, and then you will report them to us. And whether you're a larger district that just submits your own sort of spreadsheet data, or if you're a district that does the survey, there are directions in that survey and options for identifying if you have students placed at Lakeland School or a Richardson School or one of those other alternative placements, you would be reporting that through your survey. So have placed a student per the IEP team. In terms of does it factor into their identification numbers, the answer is yes. So what we sort of determined with students who are in these alternative placements is we want to make sure we're capturing, and maybe this is a good, but what we want to make sure we're capturing is that seclusion and restraint's a really big deal. It has a lot of impact on kids, on your school communities, on families. So we want to make sure that we're capturing one, where seclusion and restraints are happening, whether that's an alternative placement or in the public school, and want to make sure that we're monitoring it as it happens. So what we don't want to happen is that students are placed in one of these alternative placements and then it's just sort of out of sight, out of mind. It's not something we need to worry about. We want to make sure that the schools where these students are placed are communicating with you and that you are communicating with those schools, because if a student is being secluded and restrained a lot, that's a problem-solving process that needs to happen through IEP meetings, through review revision, through reviewing whether this is the right placement for the student, and all of those things. So that's why the reporting is set up that way, that you as LEAs would be reporting seclusion and restraints that happen at those alternative placements. That was a really long-winded answer, Lindsay. Does that answer your short question?
Yep, it does. Thank you.
Okay. Brandy, we're probably going to have to put our heads together and get back to you on court-ordered placements. Okay. So back to sort of what we're doing. So Sarah went over sort of the process in terms of data collection, and then what we do with that data when we get it, and our sort of response to support you all. Generally speaking, again, I'm going to go through a quick what, why, and how in terms of what we're doing here. These are our statewide numbers, and as Sarah mentioned, the data we get and are using always have this year-ish lag in terms of when these things happen. So our most recent data is from the 23-24 school year. So we don't have last year's data yet. That doesn't need to be reported. Well, it needs to be reported to your school boards in a week, and then needs to be reported to us by December 1. But again, what we're doing here is we are trying to get a sense of how often seclusion restraints is happening, why it's happening, to sort of reduce it at the state level. Because our numbers, since we've started collecting this data, as you can see, have remained fairly stable. That big drop, if you notice the years, happened when we were post-COVID, post-safer at home order, and lots of schools were doing virtual instruction for much of, if not all of, that 2020, 2021 school year. So other than that, we did see this dip a little bit from our first year of data collection, which is a good thing, but we would really like to see these numbers continue to go down, which again, as Sarah mentioned, is the purpose of that leveled system, so that we can do what we can to support you all at the local level in reducing seclusion and restraints. And it's because, like I said, we're not just looking at these as numbers. There's lots and lots of research out there, lots and lots of information out there about sort of the harms that happen from seclusion and restraint. We need to remember these are kids. This report is fairly old at this point, but a lot of things in there are still relevant and important in terms of recognizing what sort of the experience for families, for kids is when it comes to seclusion and restraint. So if you haven't seen this report, if you're not familiar with it, I would encourage you to take a look at that. And then in terms of how did we come up with that leveled system or how do we want this leveled system that Sarah went over to work? So what we really, really tried to do, as Sarah mentioned, is that we don't just want this to be these are 2 more documents, forms, reports that we need to fill out and report to DPI. We really tried to keep it flexible So there's no required format for your data analysis, for your root cause analysis, for the action plan that you want to do. We recognize, again, as Sarah mentioned, that this data is older, and a lot of times by the time we see those numbers and reach out to a school or a district or a director, they say, well, here are the things we've been doing for the last year to address this, which is great, which is what we want. You're all being proactive and responsive to seeing the data yourself. The other reason for the flexibility in terms of what we're asking to address seclusion and restraint is because we recognize that seclusion and restraint in most cases is like a symptom of something else going on. Or related to other things going on. So it might be, and you might be already addressing them through other areas, whether it's working through your joint federal notifications for disproportionate identifications in special education. It ties to a lot of things you're already doing. So we really tried to build in flexibility to not just give you more work to do for the sake of doing more work. Again, the consultation and coaching, we've structured it so that schools that have higher levels of seclusions and restraints who may need more support, that higher level of support is available. We've created tools and training, the root cause analysis tool, some of the action planning tools are all available to you. And the other thing in terms of how we are looking at ways to reduce seclusion and restraint is not to really overthink it. We are hearing from a lot of schools that, well, we did our root cause analysis, and what we found is we were reporting things as seclusions that weren't really seclusions. Or we have one area where we have a self-contained classroom or higher numbers of students with higher needs, and we have a great number of seclusions or restraints that are happening in that area. So really what we need to focus on is just a root cause analysis and updating IEPs and maybe doing functional behavior assessment or doing some problem solving around sort of a handful of students or maybe one classroom, one area. So it's not always going to be when we see high numbers that, large scale systematic changes need to be made. A lot of times it is sort of a handful of students or some specific situations. So that goes back to that flexibility as well. As mentioned, we do have a tool for root cause analysis. This is basically just a root cause analysis process that takes from lots of different examples of root cause analyses and tailors it specifically to seclusion and restraint data that is at your school or district level that you can just plug in there and use it as the start to your problem solving process. If you already have your own, if you like a root cause analysis process that you're familiar with, that your staff is trained in, that your teams are comfortable with, by all means use that, but we do have a tool available for you. From that root cause analysis, we also have an action planning tool. If this looks familiar to some of you who are going through joint federal notification action planning process, that's why. This is, again, has been adapted from that with the intention of, again, recognizing that if you're already doing work in this area, let's not reinvent the wheel, continue to work on what you're doing, and then just focus on maybe specifically seclusion and restraint as part of that work because it is oftentimes interrelated.
All right, I'm going to just go over some of the resources that we have to support districts, like both Sarah and Tim said. The whole intention of this leveled system of support is support. We want to make sure that we're providing what districts need in order to reduce the use of seclusion and restraint. And one of the things that we have, and this was started once we started collecting all this data, is a grant opportunity. It's the Enhancing Social Emotional Skills in Students with IEPs 1-year grant. We have a 3-year, but I'll get to that. And the 1-year grant, we have 10 awards available, 10 grants available, and we offer it to districts first who are identified at level 3 And, we go through and offer it to districts. And then if we don't have 10 at level 3, we move down to districts identified with level 2. And the ES3 1 year, districts really get to pick their level of support when we offer it to them. They can choose to meet 4 times during the course of the year, and that's a $4,000 grant award, or they can meet up to, 4 up to 10 times during the school year, and that's $10,000. And that $10,000, the money is really to kind of pay for staff time, pay for learning opportunities for staff. It can be used for a lot of ways that match the deliverables of the grant. The grant support, we have an ES3, we have a district, oh, she's not the coordinator, but anyway, she supports districts through this process, and she helps them do their root cause analysis, and she helps with action planning. She helps with that continuous improvement process. She helps with coaching and setting up teaming and learning events. So there's a lot of support in this ES3 1 year grant. Some other things that can help districts as well is, really jumping into some of the great resources and learning that we have through DPI with the Wisconsin DPI's Comprehensive School Mental Health Framework. It really looks at, the equitable multi-level system of support and integrates mental health into that. And again, it's not creating a separate system, it's integrating it. It's really making sure that we are leveraging our existing systems to better support mental health within our schools. And it integrates 6 components of that comprehensive school mental health system, which includes the top graph that you see here about that continuum of mental health supports, collaboration, needs assessment and resource mapping, mental health referral, pathways, sustainability, and data. And then that really connects to that trauma-sensitive schools. Schools and districts approach the work of building a comprehensive school mental health framework with that trauma-sensitive lens. And that trauma-sensitive lens infuses those guiding principles that you see again in that graphic of safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, empowerment, and cultural responsiveness into all aspects of the school. And it really is a process, not a product. I was involved in a district who really embraced the trauma-sensitive learning modules that are available on the DPI website. And that was a year-long project for one of the districts that I served in. And all staff were required to engage in that learning. And I have to say, we look at trauma-sensitive, but I really think it is about just being sensitive, about being responsive to all student and staff needs. So it's a really great resource to kind of gain a foundation on how to really look at supporting all of us in schools so that we don't become really responsive and fall back on seclusion and restraint. It's a great resource. Also, we have the Wisconsin Safe and Healthy Schools, or WISH Center, and that provides training to school and district teams to strengthen student and adult resilience through equitable, comprehensive school-based mental health and trauma-sensitive social-emotional learning in order to promote academic success for every student. The website that's linked in the slides includes information about district training and services. Another great resource is the culturally responsive, is the culturally responsive problem solving webpage. And it has lots of information about culturally responsive evidence-based practices, including the Promoting Excellence for All e-course and the what you see here on the slide, the culturally responsive problem solving guide. Again, great resources to help us really strengthen our systems so we don't fall back on seclusion or restraint. And then, of course, we always have that prevention related to special education. We always want to look at that comprehensive special education evaluation. We have great resources on the framework, really looking at those 6 areas of academic and functional skills. We want to look at addressing bias, which includes research-based guidance on how to identify and reduce bias in that special education evaluation process, and other resources. A great set of resources for districts to to dig into as, maybe a ongoing learning. It's a great professional resource for you. And we have, of course, the College and Career Ready IEP 5-step process. We have learning resources, the at a glance documents that I thought were fabulous resources when I was supporting staff. If we were really struggling at identifying disability related needs, I use those at a glance resource often for like some quick refreshers. And there are also the CCR IEP introductory training. That's a great resource. And what's linked on this slide is what's available for the 25-26 school year, all the learning events available to districts, to anyone. And then we also have the intervention and prevention, looking at functional behavioral assessment, a great resource. All of us, I'm sure, have supported a child, supported a student that's engaged in some really unexpected behavior in which, they were a threat to their safety or the safety of others. And we may have, resorted to using seclusion and restraint. That one time may be like, oh my gosh, we didn't see this coming. But that's a flag for us to now dig in. And a great way to dig in to figure out what's going on for that student is a functional behavioral assessment. And we have just posted our updated guidance on functional behavioral assessments, as well as we have a new one-year grant position, the FBA statewide trainer. And there are learning events at most CSAs throughout the year on that overview of conducting functional behavioral assessments, and then using the results of the functional behavioral assessment to really develop good plans, good behavior intervention plans, or really integrating the results of the FBA into IEPs so that we can better support students and really build on skills so they can communicate their wants and needs and maybe not express those wants and needs through some physical actions that result in us feeling afraid of their safety or the safety of others. So a functional behavioral assessment is a great way to dig in and figure out what's going on for that student and what they're communicating through their behavior. We also have, of course, our information, go back one, the information update bulletins. We have the providing positive behavior interventions and supports for students, which also talks about functional behavioral assessments. And we have a whole list of evidence-based practices for students with IEPs that that school teams can dig into for professional learning community, or however you want to do that however you do that within your district. And then we also have another grant, some additional grant support, the supporting neurodiverse students. That is kind of the umbrella under which the ES3, the Enhancing Social Emotional Skills for Students with IEPs, is part of. The SNS has virtual and in-person learning events throughout the year and held at various CSAs. We have the website that contains lots of learning resources, videos on topics like flexibility and regulation. You're also able to, through the webpage, the SNS webpage, schedule consultation and brainstorming sessions to really address adult practice to better support student needs. There is a booking link on the webpage, and our grant coordinator, Katie Berg, is able to really help teams dig in. She can't be part of IEP team discussions, but she can help teams really look at some of those behavior that really challenges us and help provide, some resources or learning to better address those student needs. And again, I mentioned the ES3 one-year grant that's offered to districts who have high numbers of seclusion and restraint, but we also have the 3-year grant, and that is an application process, and the application comes out usually late winter, early spring, and that's the 3-year grant. It's similar to the 1-year grant, but it's over 3 years, and it provides ongoing coaching, learning events, teaming, and there's a monetary award for that grant as well. And then finally, another grant that I want to mention is the LTAE. This is the Early Learning and Technical Assistance grant, and they have great learning events throughout the year as well. The grant provides training and technical assistance to support positive outcomes for preschoolers with IEPs. And why that's when we want to get in all that great learning for those little ones to help them communicate their wants and needs so it doesn't come out through behavior. And they have a lot of they have the language of behavior cohort. They have all kinds of different training and learning events throughout the state at different CSAs. So that's another great resource to dig into to help your teams better address that behavior that really challenges us. Knowing that none of these offers of support are a quick fix, we know that it really does take time to best address student needs, but obviously it's really well spent time, and it's all here to. We're trying to provide whatever we can support districts with these challenging situations. And then I think next is just addressing any questions that people have.
We can open it up, but I want to highlight a couple that were in the parking lot. There were a couple questions around the use of SRO in your crisis response team, and I would strongly advise against that. SROs follow police protocol. They do not have to follow your school protocol. So if a student has a behavior plan, or even as it relates to seclusion and restraint, if your team's trained in NVCI, for example, they don't have to follow that. A district I was in, SRO ended up pushing a student to the ground and cuffing them, and it was very traumatic because other kids saw that. And so I think that's just something to always keep in the back of your mind, that the SROs are not obligated to follow your school policies or procedures. So I would just definitely consider that before you involve them. And I don't know if Tim or Eva, if you have anything to add to that. Otherwise, we can open it up to other questions.
Yeah, there was another, just to add onto that, there was another question regarding what does the SRO report look like? So in the FAQ, there is no required law enforcement report. So in the reporting that comes to DPI, we've added it as an option for districts to report if SROs are involved in seclusion and restraint incidents, but it's not a required part of the reporting. So if an SRO is involved in a seclusion and restraint, yes, the school does report that as a seclusion and restraint, but the SRO is not necessarily part of that reporting. It's an optional part. So some districts use it because it can be helpful data to see if a majority of seclusion and restraints are happening involving an SRO, particularly if it's at like the high school level, which I think from what we've seen is where it happens most often in terms of seclusion and restraints, but there is no specific report unless it's unless the district chooses to report that.
I can read a question from the chat here. It says, we are trained in NVCI. If an SRO steps in and tells you to do something, do we do it even if it doesn't follow what NVCI states legally, yes or
Sorry, I see you're going. Do you have some?
I guess my thought would be, it depends. That's my legal answer. If it's during the commission of a crime, it makes sense that the SRO would take over. However, if it's like a seclusion, for example, school staff are obligated under section 118, 135 of the law. So I guess that's maybe a discussion I'd have proactively with the officer before a situation happens.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say is, there's no organization or agency that I know of that would endorse the idea of having school resource officers involved in discipline situations. So I would start with looking at what the MOU or contract with the law enforcement agent, your local law enforcement agency, looks like in terms of what their role is. I would look at school policy, school board policy in terms of what the role of the school resource officer is, because as Sarah said, if they're coming in to address a situation where a crime might have been committed or is being committed, then I certainly would probably listen to the officer. But if I am doing my nonviolent crisis intervention, I'm trying to verbally de-escalate a student, and a school resource officer comes in and says, how about I just put him in cuffs? Like, no, I don't think I would.
Yeah, so I see the follow-up to the question. I would again just recommend that maybe the director, the superintendent, and then the SRO all sit down and go over roles and responsibilities so that's all really clear.
Yeah, and if it's like when police are called to a building, like again, that comes down to sort of your process and procedures locally. Like, what is your crisis response plan? And like we have some resources on school resource officers and responding to crises. The National Association of School Resource Officers also has information in terms of what their role should be, how they respond. If it's not an SRO and someone's calling the police, again, the reason you call the police is because there's a crime being committed or potentially being committed. So that again comes down to your sort of local process and procedures. If you're not already familiar with the Office of School Safety, they would be a very good resource to reach out to if you're not sure about how to set up a more broad, more general crisis response plan at the school or district level. Certainly for students with IEPs, they're often going to have sort of behavior intervention plans, potentially crisis response plans at the individual level, which you would also maybe want to take a look at if there are police being called regularly to interact with their support responses to individual students.
There's another item in the chat that I'm wondering if you can maybe address. Can the presenters discuss what it looks like when districts are identified as overusing seclusion and restraint? Districts are fearful of this identification and have expressed that they are advising staff not to seclude or restrain, and staff are becoming injured as a result.
So again, it's not a disciplinary identification or a gotcha by any means. It is DPI's response to support districts and trying to reduce those numbers. So I guess that's all that leveling sort of went through the fact that it's nothing's required. So I would say, it's not anything to be, I mean, I would be concerned because you want those numbers to improve, but it's not anything where funding's at risk or anything like that. I guess I don't know if that addresses the question or not. It's certainly not a reason not to ever use seclusion or restraint, but it is a reason to look at what supports do you have in place and what might you do differently to reduce those numbers. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I would just add that, this system that we set it up because if you look at the seclusion and restraint law in our state statute, what it says is districts have to report the number of incidents in this specific way to DPI. And that's the end of it. It doesn't say what, if anything, we have to do with it. It doesn't say what, if anything, school districts have to do with it. Again, our overarching goal, we designed this to be supportive to address this because we don't want kids secluded and restrained. I can't imagine any more than they have to be, and I can't imagine anyone on this call or anyone working in schools wants kids secluded or restrained any more than is necessary. So what we set up here was based on the data we were getting, which says it's a relatively small number of students, usually at the elementary school level. Almost always, something around 3/4 of the time, it's students with IEPs. So we set this up through the ES3 grant, through the universal things. The things that Eva went through was because we set up this system to be supportive. In that if you are in a district and you are looking at your data and you have seclusion and restraints that are sort of widespread across multiple school buildings in your district, you might want to look at universal approaches that can help reduce that. If you are in a district where you have, say, a self-contained program where a lot of your seclusion and restraints are happening with a handful of students, that's where looking at training and support through that ES3 grant or reviewing how we do functional behavior assessments are done. So again, this is you're reporting the data to us, but you're doing that anyway. You're doing that by state statute. Everything after that, we would hope would be a collaborative effort in the interest of reducing seclusion and restraints for the purpose that we're trying to reduce them. So the language in the law is pretty clear that seclusion and restraints happen when a student is a imminent physical risk to the safety of self or others. We feel like, and through the data that we are collecting and through our interactions with schools, there are seclusions and restraints are happening that don't sort of meet that criteria of imminent physical risk to self or others. Now, if someone's not doing a seclusion or restraint, and they are becoming injured, ironically, that might be a situation where a seclusion or restraint might actually be appropriate. So these situations are high intensity, they're dangerous, they're anxiety provoking. So if that is happening in your school or district, I would start some conversations sooner rather than later. And is this student, if it is an individual student, a significant risk to the safety of themselves or others? Really doing things around that imminent physical risk and having conversations and problem solving around that, whether it's at the individual classroom, school, or district level. And everything, again, beyond the reporting to us, it's not punitive, it's not statutorily required. We want to help because we don't want kids secluded or restrained.
Thank you for that. There's another question in the chat. Are LEAs required to disclose their crisis plan to families? In school board policies, I typically see plans relating to intruders, fires, natural disasters, but not necessarily student behavior.
I would say if it's an individual student crisis plan, that's part of the student's record. So technically the family could do a records request and see that crisis plan, or if it's part of an IEP, obviously they would have access to that as well. If it's like a school-wide crisis plan, I would say no, that's not a requirement to publish that. I would recommend checking with your school attorney as far as if a records request came through, whether that would have to be released or not. There's different guidance about this, particularly as it relates to school safety, not wanting those plans public in case there ever was like a planned school violence situation. So again, I would say generally no, but I would check with school attorney if somebody does request that through a records request.
Maybe crowdsource this question. I feel like there must be districts out there that have sort of, generally speaking, for student behavior, here's how our school, our district responds. Are there schools out there? Any of you all put it in the chat? Yes, we do. Here's how we address individual student crisis situations.
Yeah, people are saying in the student handbook.
And so then if it's in the student handbook, sure, of course, parents would have access to that, I would imagine.
Thank you for that. The questions are kind of coming fast and furious now because we're getting closer to the end of our time. Do you have any suggestions for rural districts that do not have options for alternative programming or placement?
Eva?
Well, that might be a time where the district wants to look at some of the grant support or even just the brainstorming. The SNS, the Supporting Neurodiverse Students Professional Learning System, depending on availability, can provide a series of learning events to districts to help them really dig into how to best meet student needs, especially if they have those significantly divergent social emotional learning needs. So that's a resource for districts, and it's intended for any district. Again, it just is about availability. And of course, always applying for those, like the ES3 3-year grant can really help districts dig in. and looking at, again, our FBA statewide trainer, some of the training events that are being held throughout the state to, again, help teams dig in. Because I know that oftentimes, like Tim and Sarah shared, the data is a lag when we are, saying you've been identified as a level 3, there's a lag, a year and a half has already happened. Um, and so when we reach out to districts, sometimes you're making me dizzy there, Tim. When we reach out to districts, they say, we've already dug into this, but now I lost track because I was getting dizzy. We districts have said we've already dug into this, we're good, or maybe it was like one student we really struggled on really getting on top of what were those disability related needs and how to address those disability related needs. But some of the grants staff that we have can really help teams do that and figure out a better approach, some better, specially designed instruction, some adult changes, environmental changes. So it's really about reaching out and seeing, and keep reaching out until we can help you figure it out and help you really dig into that root cause analysis and action planning around staff change to better meet those students' needs.
Thanks for that, Eva.
I know it's such hard work, and I'm sorry, it's just such hard work.
It
And
is.
sometimes, yeah, it is. And there are some of those that we've all had those students where it's just we're having such a hard time getting on top of on figuring out how to meet their needs. And it's just one of those things that you just have to keep trying and trying something new and reaching out. And that's what we're here for. And we can, any of us can help connect you to other resources and help brainstorm ways to solve those problems that we're having to meet those students' needs.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Next question from the parking lot. If a student is dysregulated in a classroom and begins destroying property or attempting to harm staff, can staff transport a student to a seclusion room, or do staff need to clear the current space and not transport the student?
This is exactly one of those scenarios that, it's important to think about what the law says and why it says it. One, if the student is judged to be an imminent physical risk to self or others, and the determination is the least restrictive intervention feasible, which is also in the law, is seclusion or restraint. Then yes, the staff who are trained in those techniques are able to transport that student. Again, if it is the least restrictive intervention feasible. Obviously, a less restrictive intervention would be to try and sort of verbally intervene and support that student using words to remove themselves from the environment or whatever they need to be. But of course, there are situations where that can't happen. The questions about like clearing a classroom, those are again highly dependent on the individual scenario, the specific scenario. These are again high intensity, high anxiety provoking, dynamic changing situations where you've really got to think on your toes. Proactively thinking about it, a couple of things to consider is, yes, you can clear a classroom, but if you then physically prevent that student from leaving, you are now secluding that student in a classroom. And I cannot think of a classroom in the world that is free of objects or fixtures that might harm the student, which means you are doing a seclusion, but you are doing it in a way that is not allowed by law. Because if you are going to seclude a student, it has to be in a room where the door doesn't have a lock and that is free of objects and fixtures that could harm the student. So if clearing the classroom works and you're not physically preventing that student from leaving, but it gives the student an opportunity to sort of focus on the verbal intervention, do some de-escalation techniques that work for that student, and that's the best thing for that student. You can do that, but ensure that you are not secluding that student in a classroom because it is not safe for both the staff member or the student. If the student truly is a danger to self or others, imminent physical risk to self or others, finding a way to transport that student to the seclusion room is probably the way to do it.
Thank you for that. Is there, somewhat related, is there concern if special ed staff are the only ones trained in NBCI, for example, but seclusion and restraint was provided for a regular ed student?
I wouldn't think so unless they're missing their specially designed instruction minutes. I mean, I don't think you'd want it to happen too often. If you're finding it happening often, I would get somebody else trained. But it would be the like, what are they missing during that restraint is would be my concern.
Yeah. I get that question a fair amount about who should be trained on crisis intervention, and there's things to think about. On the one hand, yes, if you have lots of people trained on how to physically restrain a student, sometimes that training and crisis intervention is like, and being trained in physical restraint is like closet space. If you have it, you're going to use it. So overly training people, particularly in the physical restraint, you want to make sure you have enough that you're able to keep staff and students safe, but having everyone trained in the actual physical restraint part maybe isn't necessary. But there's certainly value in some of those other parts of the training programs about verbal de-escalation techniques, verbal intervention, personal safety things. So thinking about who's trained and how, there's lots of sort of variables to think about, including if your special education staff is all sort of housed on one far end of the building, and there are areas that they may need to respond to. You also want to think about like physical location of these people and who's trained and things like that. So there's lots of things to think about.
And what if the seclusion area is in a special ed classroom?
Say more. What do you mean, what if?
Lindsay?
Yeah, sorry, that one came in as a direct message. I believe what they're saying is they have a safe space in their building, but it is inside a special ed classroom. So it's built inside a special ed classroom is how I'm reading that. But if somebody wants to unmute and clarify that. And I think the concern is back to the general education student. So if a general education student is being taken into a room that's built inside a special education classroom for that seclusion piece, is there concern about that? Certainly, we try to not have general education students learning in special education spaces as much as possible.
Well, if they're being secluded, presumably that's not a learning experience. There's certainly things to think about. Again, if you have the closet space, you're going to use it. So that is one thing to think about, is the easier you make it to seclude a student, the more likely it is to happen in a lot of cases, whether they're general or special ed. In terms of like, if the question is, could that space be used for general education students? I don't know why it wouldn't be able to be. There may be some sort of privacy, confidentiality concerns, but I don't know.
There is one question that I think we haven't touched on yet about the reporting, the S&R reporting. For multi-district charter schools, does the authorizing district complete the report, or does each partnering district need to include the school and report for their resident students?
I believe independent charter schools need to do their own reporting. Eva, Sarah, do you know?
I don't know if the person who asked that question, Nikki Hagan, I don't know if you're still on. If you want to unmute and clarify your question. Otherwise, we can follow up. she must not be on anymore. So we'll follow up with Nikki and see if we can get some clarification on that question.
All right. Thank you so much, Tim and Eva and Sarah, for joining us. This is definitely a hot topic. And I see that you have a slide up with your contact information, and we will encourage people to continue to utilize the parking lot or reach out as they have additional questions. Thank you everyone for hanging in there today with our little shuffle in timing and our technical difficulties at the beginning. So I appreciate everyone hanging in there with us as we try to successfully meet your needs in these topics. Our next session will be held on October 15th from 10 to 12. And just a reminder again, you do need to register each month. So that registration link is available in your agenda. Topics in our next meeting will include timely information regarding private school evaluations, special needs scholarship program, and trends and patterns the department is seeing with complaints. So we wish you all a wonderful afternoon. And since this is our first meeting of the year, a safe and happy school year. And take care.